Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Thanks very much for coming by. Before I start, I was going to do two things. A, ask if anybody has any questions, comments, observations from last week. Okay. Secondly, my focus is going to shift a little bit. I am still all about the history of pandemics and diseases. That's what I concentrate on. However, what I think I'm going to do, what I am going to do, is I'm going to start talking about the very individual epidemics, the individual diseases and their epidemics, if that's okay. So I was going to start today talking about malaria in terms of world history. The female mosquito, malaria comes from the vector, as doctors like to say. The way it's carried to infect is through the female mosquito, which kills more human beings than any other animal ever in history. 90% of these deaths are attributable to this first or second bite that a person would receive from the mosquito. Malaria accounts for about 90% of the deaths from all these other diseases that are spread around by mosquitoes. The WHO, the World Health Organization, said that 300 million people get malaria every year. 430,000 die from it every year. Most children under 5 are affected, most in sub-Saharan Africa. Also, other warm tropical areas with lots of rain, like South Africa, China, India, parts of Southeast Asia, and Central and South America, are the worst places where this can develop. Not as deadly as, believe it or not, as some of the pandemics and some of the diseases that we talk about. But most people believe that there's a higher factor of the ability to get it in third world countries, which is very, very disconcerting. So we've been in other countries that are trying to escape poverty. It's a never-ending problem with people, really, society in general, not really doing a whole heck of a lot about that. Although individual agencies, certain religious organizations do a lot of work in that area, but it's not nearly enough. So the way the disease works is it causes infections. There's 4 different parasites. Has a life cycle that has the mosquito looking for human hosts. This genus of mosquito often thrives even in colder climates. So there's no guarantee that you can go to a colder climate and be safe. It has spread all over the world. It originated in sub-Saharan Africa, probably about, and listen to this figure, 100 million years ago. And in old world primates. Remember, we had said at the very, very beginning that some of these diseases and some of these bacteria are older than people are. And this certainly bears out with this. Agriculture made the spread among humans more possible. And in my research is about this, I found this to be very, very true. There's these positive things and then a concomitant negative thing right with it. So we talk about, for example, we're going to talk a lot about world trade. And we're going to talk about the fact that ships were now able to travel up and down different routes, trade routes, which was a good thing, and spreading around all these different items from one place in the world to the other, good thing, but they also started to bring disease. And we saw that a little bit last week when we were talking about America, the American exchange, the Columbian exchange in the Americas, et cetera, et cetera. Agriculture made it more increased with the spread of agriculture from Neolithic times, even from that far back, 10,000 years ago. Again, European expansion, European imperialism brought it to many, many more countries, America and Africa in particular. Much of its destructive possibilities lie in its ability to repeatedly infect and incapacitate it over long periods of time. So you can get it again and again and again and again. It paralyzed armies, again, in terms of the historical impetus of this. So many wars were affected by outbreaks of malaria. Paralyzed armies, altered public works projects in a lot of different places, helped continents remain in perpetual states of poverty. And again, I'm talking about Africa, parts of South America, parts of Central America, etc. Evidence of malaria goes back 5,000 years in 5,000-year-old texts, not only European texts, but Chinese and Sumerian and Indian texts. Hippocrates, you remember him, mentions it in about 400 BCE. He was talking about it by name. May not have mentioned it by name, actually by that name, because malaria comes from the Italian, which is literally bad air, which is where the word comes from. Other ancient writers have similar references. They had no idea how it developed or how it spread. The prevalent theory at the time was it was diseased air, again, which is where the name derives, or miasmatic coming from bad air, which gave it its name. Poor record keeping explains bad reporting. However, significant reporting of the Roman army dealing with outbreaks of this and the connection with aqueducts and stagnant water. People were starting to realize this wasn't particularly necessarily from bad air, but bad water. Yes. Sewer, which ones you have? Oh, you had?
We
Yeah.
had the sub-Saharan.
What, Kelly?
We had the American sub-Saharan.
Right, but this
Then
is,
the Croatia Maxima, Rome.
but the Croatia Maxima is in Rome, and this was an aqueduct, a public bath.
Looks ugly for public baths.
Yes, that was very, very popular and very, very common in Rome, in the Roman Empire, and thought to be very, very beyond its time, that they would even have something like this. However, as you can imagine, this was a super spreader in terms of any kind of diseases. People would come into this bath, they would have cuts, sores, infections, whatever. They would, pee in the bath water, which still happens. We go into the ocean, and sometimes we relieve ourselves in the ocean. So these things are still happening, but in this kind of centralized place, it was even worse. What, babe?
Ready?
Yeah. Because of the quirks of imperialism, these countries going and invading, taking over other countries. Usually the story was Europeans traveling to America, to Africa, to other parts of the world, and taking over the culture, enslaving the culture sometimes, or even just trading with the culture. But as in the case of the British in India or others in India taking over the whole culture, what would happen is that this disease began to spread all over the place. And the Romans back in ancient Rome would talk about it. Roman soldiers would report on how all of a sudden these outbreaks of this disease, which they weren't really even sure what it was at the time, would break out and the soldiers would die from it. It was originally thought, so the whole imperialism thing, because the British and others had colonies in the Americas as well as Africa, they actually found something in the Americas while they were looking for this cure, for some kind of cure for this disease that was killing people in Africa, Europeans in Africa all the time. And what they found was that the Native Americans who would get malaria would cure it by this particular tree, the chinoa tree. And they would get the bark, as you see here, and they would scrape off the bark, and what they developed, what they had, was quinine. So imperialism in America led the imperialists in Africa to be able to do more imperializing, I made that word up, by using something they had in one set of colonies to use it to conquer other colonies. And that's what happened with quinine in particular. The imperialization of Africa, which started off early, 14th, 15th centuries, didn't really get going until a number of things happened, a number of inventions happened. The first was quinine. The second was ships that no longer had to rely on sails and the wind, but could now use steam engines, etc., to travel. They didn't have to worry about getting stuck in African rivers, in African lakes. They didn't have to worry about the wind being in a right direction or wind at all to be able to move. Sometimes in Africa, sailing ships would get stuck in a river for days or longer because there was no wind to propel them. Sails, they had to have wind. With the invention of the steamship, it didn't matter anymore. They can go wherever they wanted to go in whatever kind of river they were sailing in, and they didn't have to worry about that. And the third thing was the invention of the gun, the pistol, the rifle, rapid shooting guns. Because now, of course, any kind of opposition they had from the native population, which at one time, when everybody was using swords and bows and arrows, the natives had an advantage. Now that advantage was gone with the invention of the rifle. So quinine, the steamship, the rifle allowed Europeans to really conquer the rest of the world. There was nothing that could stop them after that. So it was a long process, but this is quinine. You can go to the next one. Huh?
The Belgian Congo.
Yes. One thing I wanted to finish about quinine and all of that, research points to the fact that Jesuit missionaries, Jesuits are a Catholic order of priests. The official name is the Society of Jesus, but they call themselves the Jesuits. I was educated by the Jesuits, so I had to put a plug in for them at one point. They were really responsible for bringing a lot of quinine and that kind of stuff to other parts of the world, and being able to let some of the native people actually enjoy the benefits of being injected, of receiving quinine. Research, okay. As a matter of fact, they used to call quinine the Jesuit bark, from the bark of the tree. It was shunned, interestingly, when the Protestant Reformation came around and Catholics and Protestants were fighting each other. Protestants wouldn't take quinine because it was a Catholic drug. We see some of that kind of stupidity in today's world occasionally, but as the royals, particularly in Great Britain, took quinine and were saved by it successfully, Jesuit bark became accepted everywhere in the Western world. By 1865, other European nations had stolen chinoa trees and had planted them in their various cities, and they were growing and harvesting the bark and didn't have to rely on the Spanish or the Spanish Empire to get it. So it rapidly traveled all over the world. It took over 90% of the continent. Europeans took over 90% of the African continent between 1881 and 1914. The Industrial Revolution also contributed to the fact that health got a little bit better in terms of that. There was a Berlin Conference from 1884 to 1885, which ushered in the scramble to Africa, not just from the British, but from every other European nation. Okay, so William Gorgas. I want to get to him in a second. Malaria is still extant in a lot of these African countries and still kills millions and millions of people over generations. And it really is the major cause of African poverty. Huh? Oh, I'm sorry. Quinine was a model for future research for drugs that would combat disease. The next thing I wanted to talk about in terms of quinine was the Panama Canal in particular. Now, the Panama Canal canals in general were big deals in world history. The Suez Canal, it cut off hundreds and hundreds of miles in terms of travel. The Panama Canal, of course, instead of traveling, I'll get to him in a second, instead of traveling all around South America to get from one side to the other, saved, as I said, hundreds and hundreds of miles. And building it was quite a feat at the time. Part of the reason was malaria. Malaria was extant in Panama, wet, dry, hot place. The mosquitoes loved to be there, and so they would infect these very, very various people. Yellow fever, another epidemic that we'll talk about, scared a lot of people, but it was really malaria that was the biggest problem in the Panama Canal. Did we talk about Gorgas?
No, he's right there now.
Yes, okay. So this guy, Dr. William Gorgas, who lived from 1854 to 1920, was one of the doctors who was responsible for doing something about malaria in the construction of the Panama Canal. He began working on the problem in 1905 and made several discoveries about it, discerning that, first of all, the mosquito we talked about, caused the virus, proof that protozoa, so we're getting a little scientific here, caused a human disease, and that particular human disease. He had other doctors that helped him in that regard. I don't know if do we have any of the other doctors? Yes, Dr. Carlos Finley was one who worked on it, and Charles Leverin. Do we have him, Gary? Charles Leverin, another doctor. Just to get picked. These are photographs; they're not paintings. Discovered the exact mosquito that was carrying and how it was transmitted in the first place. So another theme that we talk about in all of this is how there were these medical people, doctors as we understand doctors who go to medical school, but even some of the, like Hippocrates and some of the other people we talked about in ancient times, were actual healers. They were physicians. And they were working on this at the same time. They didn't have the information we have, but they were working on it during all this time. They set about eliminating the mosquito, and they began to spray and all the drainage areas around the canal. Any standing water was treated to be able to kill the virus. And like I say, he started in 1904. By 1906, yellow fever was, wait for it, completely eradicated in Panama. Completely. In a year. 2 years maybe. And here's something about some of these diseases that we need to emphasize. So while it was eradicated as any kind of problem in the canal and in almost all what we would call advanced nations, it still kills people in some not advanced countries. Now, vaccines and such are distributed. It's getting better, but it's still around. I don't want to give the impression that it doesn't exist anymore. There's some diseases that, thank God, don't exist anymore because they've been eradicated, but not so much with this. And I'm going to move on to another disease. So if you have any questions about this.
Were most of these doctors American?
No. I'm sorry. Were most of them American? Yes. Were all of them American? No. There are many European doctors. Most of them are American or European. There are some from the Middle East that we've mentioned already that we will talk again about. But Levarin, I believe, was European, actually, originally. So the next disease I wanted to talk about was tuberculosis, TB. Who?
There's somebody I'm looking for.
No. Why?
No, I just wanna make sure I need the right slide up there.
I don't think so.
Okay,
Oh, Ross. No, I'm thinking about all these guys. I don't remember them.
okay.
What's that?
All right, so just show me the plan.
Okay. Tuberculosis made the jump from cows and sheep and horses to humans about 17,000 years ago. So the disease existed, but didn't make the jump to human beings until then. Neolithic, how do we know this? Neolithic remains, 9,000 years old, show us signs of people who had tuberculosis. Egyptian mummies, some Egyptian mummies that have been examined show tuberculosis. References to the Hebrew scriptures or even to Hindu texts talk about the descriptions. They didn't call it tuberculosis, but descriptions of a disease that is definitely tuberculosis. It killed 2 billion people throughout history. Currently ranks as the most deadly disease in the world. Now, hold that thought, because we're going to be talking about a lot of diseases that kill a lot of people. But TB probably structurally and definitely in terms of numbers probably kills more people than anything else, any other disease. People who are otherwise sick or malnourished, weak to begin with, succumb to the disease more easily. History referred to it as, if you remember this, they didn't call it TB. What did they call it? You remember? Consumption. Died of consumption. Because a debilitating weight loss is usually a symptom, and or pneumonia is usually a symptom of tuberculosis. Currently, people co-infected with HIV, for example, or TB, are especially in danger. How is it acquired? It's acquired by inhaling another's infected secretions. So coughs can spread it. Breathing with somebody who's infected breathing in a space with somebody who's infected. It can last in a space for hours, and so that makes it a little bit easier to get. Families, places like prisons, hospitals, most vulnerable to be able to catch TB. The bacteria is hardy, sustains attacks in hosts, can withstand attacks when they're landed in a host. Immunosuppressed individuals, we use that term a lot lately, are also very susceptible because TB breaks through barricades and replicates uncontrollably. Remember, we had said in the first session that these viruses and germs have been around forever, before people, or around the same time as people and animals. So they are living. They want to live. They want to replicate, and that's what they're all about. They get a host so that they can replicate and live. As long as we remember that, they're living things. Well, it can spread through the body very, very easily, very quickly. It's universally fatal. And they call that military TB. The TB that's particularly fatal, they call it military level TB. The most depressing aspect is its long and its debilitating results when somebody gets it. Despite its long history of TB, there is little mention of it in history. We don't have a lot of mention of it in the Judeo-Christian Bible, those other texts that we were talking about. The Greeks don't talk about it a lot until about the 18th century, probably because it was always around and people just took it for granted. They never named it. It was just a thing. It was like death and taxes, if I may be so bold. It just existed. It was forgotten for very, very many long years before people began to identify it again. The Industrial Revolution of the 18th century was an important turning point in the history of tuberculosis. The rural nature of society kept the spread very, very low. But this changed, of course, after the Industrial Revolution. Because why? Because cities started to develop. And cities, people flocked to the cities. Urbanization, we call it, when people started to move out of the countryside and out of the farms to get jobs in towns and cities. And then the other phenomenon that occurred is that as cities developed, poorer sections of cities developed. Immigration brought a lot of people to live in particularly poor sections of the city. And the beat goes on, so to speak. It just got worse and worse and worse in some places. Changed in particularly after 1750, where it was lucrative for new industries to spread and to work in very crowded cities. Slums were dirty and crowded. Sanitation was unknown. The streets were full of garbage, cesspool-like, many rodents, mice and rats. Perfect for any waterborne diseases like cholera, typhoid, and TB. Gastrointestinal and respiratory diseases. Death from TB increased 2 or 3 times. A quarter of the deaths in Western Europe, especially people already weak from other diseases. It began to be seen as a disease of the poor who had no living condition options. They had to be where they were. Did you raise your hand? Oh, I'm sorry. It surpassed the plague, smallpox, and cholera as the most serious infectious disease. Let me say that again. It surpassed the plague, smallpox, and cholera as the most serious infectious disease. Previously believed to be a supernatural punishment. We talked about this in the first session too. After the 18th century, a number of famous artists, composers, authors succumbed. And it was, and people are weird. People are very strange. It got to be, after a while, cool to have TB. It made you very artistic and very interesting to have the symptoms of being pale-skinned and kind of thin and sort of ephemeral looking, like you were thinking about high thoughts. It wasn't that. You were dying. You were feeling terrible. But like a lot of artists happened to have caught tuberculosis, and so it was a thing. It was a strange thing. We're very weird beings. Previously believed to be supernatural, as I had said. It became a badge of refinement. Are you ready for this? Many authors romanticized the disease because their loved ones had succumbed, and so it was like a personal thing. When he died of tuberculosis, and he was, because he was so brilliant or he was so cool, he died of TB. Like, you wouldn't get just an ordinary disease, he died of TB. Even an image of those affected in Europe and Asia took on a noble, handsome appearance. Pale skin was sought after in women's fashion. Near the end of the 19th century, this shifted again. Science had discovered the pathogen that caused TB. Personality traits, artistic, beautiful people had nothing to do with the disease. One had nothing to do with the other. Science and medicine replaced romance. Thank God. As a result, sufferers were again isolated. Scientifically, it was seen as the terrible disease that it is, in fact. Convalescent therapy and popular literature, I guess, had praised this new thing called the sanitarium. There was sanitaria. I don't know if we have a picture of that.
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Drastically improved quality of life because it took people out of deadly environments. They compare the sanitariums, the beginning of the sanitariums, to what hospice is now. Robert Koch. Got Koch? What?
I do it someplace. There it is.
Yeah, Koch was a big deal. Physician, microbiologist, discovered that tuberculosis was caused by infection with a small, slow-growing bacterium, not that it wasn't miasma. Miasma is the thing they thought about all the time. Miasma, bad air, that it was in the air, that it was just a germ that was around. He had narrowed it down to a particular specific infection with a slow-moving bacterium. Forever changed how infectious disease was viewed and treated. Enhanced, and this is Koch's big deal, he was the inventor, so to speak, of the germ theory of disease. We no longer would talk about these other miasmic reasons for why people got sick. There were germs. There were these creatures, for want of a better word, these live things. His work was published in 1876. Medical improvements were very, very slow. 1876. But it changed how bacteria would be studied in the laboratory. His 4 postulates, he had 4 postulates. Do we have that in that other picture, or we didn't do that? Although that was it, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Yes. His 4 postulates. The suspected pathogen must be present in all cases of the disease and absent from healthy animals. I'm sorry, I don't see so good.
I know. That's what I'm reading for you.
The suspected pathogen must be grown in pure culture. Cells from a pure culture of the suspected pathogen must cause disease in a healthy animal. There has to be a cause and effect between all of these things. Discover this thing, it has to have a cause and effect. The suspected pathogen must be re-isolated and shown to be the same as the original. These were the 4 ways that he figured.
Yes,
Huh?
it's the same.
I'm sorry?
Last one it said it has to be shown to be the same as the original.
Right,
So those 2 are the original.
right. And that's what Koch is known for. He really changed what was known about it.
Can you explain those 4 postulates in English for us, please?
So, the first one, the suspected pathogen must be present in all cases of the disease and absent from healthy animals. The germ that you think is at the cause of this particular disease must be present in the people who were sick and absent from people who weren't sick. Or, I mean, it seems like a very simple thing, but
Yes.
that was his first postulate. The second one is the suspected pathogen must be grown in pure culture. I think what that means is that you can and this is like a medical. I'm out of my area here, but I believe it means that in order to isolate the pathogen, you have to be able to grow it in a pure culture.
With no other substance.
Right.
Okay.
Thirdly, cells from a pure culture of the suspected pathogen must cause disease in a healthy animal. So once you do number two,
Right.
you should be able to get that and inject an animal, and the animal will get sick.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, the suspected pathogen must be re-isolated and shown to be the same as the original. I guess that means that in order to secure that it's the same XYZ that you're talking about, you have to recreate it and have come up with the same XYZ.
Okay. Thank you.
I think that's what it means. But Koch, he would really, he changed a very, very significant mindset in terms of medicine and all that by his discoveries. It's a standard now for scientists to conclusively prove that a specific organism causes a specific disease. Some 15 years later, every other human pathogen has been isolated because of his work, which is a real big deal. It was around the same time that pasteurization was being used. If you remember Louis Pasteur, French scientist, he actually worked for the wine industry, and people were getting sick from bad wine. So he came up with this method that later was called pasteurization, and was applied not to wine but to milk, which is the boiling of the milk, basically it's a little bit more than that, but boiling of the wine, boiling of the milk, and destroying any pathogens in the milk. I mean, pasteurized milk was like such a big deal for such a long time. It's also around the same time that a vaccine was developed for tuberculosis. New effective diagnostic tools had been invented all during the 1880s and 1890s. Scientists picked up where he left off. The stethoscope was invented around this time. A guy by the name of William Rankin. You have him there? What, babe?
I think we passed him. There he is.
This guy invented X-rays. Now, think about it. This was like a monumental discovery. All on the heels of this other stuff that they're investigating. Nothing would help those, however, infected until the 1950s with the discovery of antibodies. Despite all of this, TB is still very deadly. Very deadly, and still people are susceptible to it. It's not like you say it's wiped out. You know, there's no evidence of this anymore. It's still around. Any questions about tuberculosis?
I just want to say, I know they still test for TB, and I remember getting the test. It was right on the inner part of the arm and 4 little dots.
Right.
I don't remember why I got it, but
I had to do it because I worked in probation and we had so much contact with people in jails and courts.
yeah, I don't remember
Every
why.
year we had to do it.
Where'd you work in probation?
Sullivan County,
Fulton County?
Sullivan.
Sullivan. Next is typhus. Typhoid, typhus. Has had an impact on almost every war fought in Europe and Asia in 4.5 centuries. Close quarters, unsanitary conditions is usually how it spreads. unimagined crowded civilizations, camps, etc., were breeding grounds for the disease and the parasite, especially the human body louse, which is the vector. There he is. It's a cute little guy. Yeah, we always, when we were doing the slide, that's what she did. She said, "Ugh."
That's really gross looking.
Thank you. You can get rid of it. You get rid of it. The ability to spread typhus is very, very common, and it spreads kind of commonly, or easily, I should say. It's transmitted by the lice rather than ticks, fleas, or mites. So by this cute little creature. Scratching allows it to enter the blood, then multiplies and attacks the cells. It's usually demonstrated by rash, fever, low blood pressure, localized tissue death. Death in 40% of people who are affected. The earliest known reference about typhus is from the Greeks in around 430 to 426 BCE, the 5th century BCE. There was something called the Athenian Plague, which I think we talked about, the plague in Athens, that was described by our buddy Thucydides during the Peloponnesian Wars. The Peloponnesian Wars were wars that were fought between Athens and Sparta. They were the two most powerful city-states in Greece before Greece was Greece. And they fought wars off and on for a number of years. And during those wars, this disease made its presence very, very much known. Typhoid fever is unrelated to typhus, interestingly enough. It's a waterborne disease spread by immigrants, many immigrants. We talked about, if you remember, Typhoid Mary. Typhoid Mary, or Mary Malone. You have a picture of her?
I'm getting it.
I'm sorry. Was a lady, an immigrant to the United States from Ireland, who had the disease, and it spread from her in America. It is probably the disease that was prevalent in the Athenian Plague, as I said before. Another example of this in history, 1489, a Christian army had surrounded the Muslims at Granada in Spain, when Spain had been taken over by Islam for a very long time. What is this? Oh, this is the map of Granada. Spain had been conquered by Islam, by the Moors, a long time ago. The Moors, Moros in Spanish, is where they got that name, the Moors, and actually occupied in Spain for hundreds of years, and the disease, I believe, came with them at Granada. The epidemic killed about 1,700 within a few months only. Soldiers returning from spreading the disease, laying the groundwork for all future European examples of the disease. All future European examples of the disease. The war between Christians and Muslims gave the disease the opportunity to spread, and we see that all the time. World War I, in particular, as later when we talk about the great flu epidemic. There's a couple of theories about that. The latest theory about the flu epidemic is that it started in America and went to Europe and the rest of the world when American troops went to World War I. That's it. We'll talk about that later. Every war fought on the European continent in the next 500 years would be affected in some way by the typhus epidemic, and probably Asia too. The jury's still out on that, but they're pretty sure. In 1519, Charles I, we talked about him before, Charles I, King of Spain, who was also the king of the Holy Roman Empire. I have to do this quick historical thing. So the Roman Empire falls in 5 something AD, CE. And what happens is this Holy Roman Empire is formed by part of France, part of Germany, part of what we would call Switzerland and all those countries. And it's a completely distinct empire called the Holy Roman Empire, which the Protestants used to say was neither Holy Roman nor an empire, but that's another story. And Charles was probably one of the most powerful emperors of that area, because he had become, when his parents died, he had become the King of Spain, where they called him Charles I, but he also became Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. You don't have to remember, that's not a big deal, but the same guy. And we talked about him before. He was the undisputed head not only of the empire, but of the church, the Catholic Church. And everybody in those days, the majority of Europeans were Roman Catholic. So the Pope was still the head of the church, but he was the head of the Roman Catholic population in his empire. And had a great amount, and the Americas. Remember, he picks up the Americas too, because Columbus and all that stuff. So he had a very, very big empire. Soon he was at war with the French, the Ottomans, and the Protestants also. All fought under the scourge of typhus. Typhus was able to spread during all of those religious wars. The Catholics were fighting the Protestants. The Catholics were fighting the Muslims. The Catholics were fighting other Catholics in the Holy Roman Empire were fighting other Catholics in different empires. It was a mishigas, as we say. All fought under the scourge of typhus. Bubonic plague had struck in the middle of some of these epic battles. Then typhus, so suffering from bubonic plague, which we talked about, and then a typhus epidemic right after it, right in the midst of it. At one point, the British entered into this. Now the British were a Protestant country, and they entered into it actually on the side of the Holy Roman Empire. So we don't have to go into details, but it suited his purpose to back up the Catholics. So he did, but then he switched sides in the middle of it and joined the French. Historians say that if typhus had not happened, if there was not a typhus epidemic, it's likely that Henry VIII would not have started the Church of England, and England would not have become a Protestant country. We don't know, but these are the parts of history that I always say depend totally upon luck. You know, the old joke of if he would have turned left instead of right, Moses would have had all the oil in the Roman Catholic and Protestant conflict blossomed in 1521. Charles condemned Martin Luther. Again, typhus forestalled seemingly Catholic victory, allowing the Protestants to spread all over Europe. How this particular disease and this epidemic affected history in terms of the spread of Protestantism. In the 30-Year War, is, historians list all the wars that are the worst in terms of death and destruction. So what do you think is the worst of all the wars ever fought? What do you think is the worst in terms of people dying and death and destruction? Nope. Think about it.
World War I?
World War II.
World War II.
What's second? What?
World War I.
World War I. What's third?
Civil War.
The 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War, like, happened so long ago, and yet so incredibly destructive.
But those were world wars, not wars fought
on American.
between themselves on American soil, like the the Civil
Like the
War.
American Revolution or the Civil
Or the
War. Right.
Revolution.
Right. Well, it stands to reason that a world war would be more destructive than a local, right?
Right, but sizes, you know,
Yeah, the people.
Yeah, but even
Yeah.
something like the Civil War, which killed almost 1 million people,
right,
it still was fought just in the United States.
right, so.
So you get something like World War II, which is literally all over the world. Yeah, it's much worse. But typhus became an epidemic in Europe too. I cannot discuss the role of the Protestant Reformation or any of that in history without talking about the typhus epidemic. I mean, it's very much a part. Both sides gained and lost because of this epidemic. Napoleon I, maybe more than anybody else in modern history, has his reputation destroyed by typhus because of the Russian debacle. So again, not to get into too much detail, but I think, as we know, if we don't, Napoleon wanted to rule the world. He certainly wanted to rule all of Europe, if not the world. And at one point, he decided to invade Russia. So he invades Russia with almost 1 million men, as it turns out. He comes back from the Russian invasion with less than 50,000. And part of the reason, well, there were a lot of reasons. Part of the reason was typhus that struck his army on the way back. Foraging, they had to forage for food because they had no food. The Russians cut them off from anything. They left them nothing, and exposed the troops to disease. Typhus was rampant in Poland during this time, and the French were going right through Poland. So French troops, as they looked for supplies and looked for food, etc., they caught typhus and spread all over the army. More disasters even in Moscow. Leo Tolstoy, the famous Russian author who wrote War and Peace, recounts the disaster among French troops during the campaign in Moscow. There were many factors, like I say, but at least 250,000 French troops died just from typhus. We move, historically speaking, to the Irish potato famine. So, set the scene a little bit. So, in Great Britain, in the beginning to middle 19th century, they had taken over Ireland. Ireland was part of the empire. The majority of the people who lived in Southern Ireland were Roman Catholic, and there were a lot of disputes between the Roman Catholic population and the Protestant population in Ireland, as you know from modern history. The Catholic Irish population relied on the potato. Now, the potato had come, and I'm sorry to draw this out, but I think it's important. The potato came from America. The potato is not native to Europe or Asia or any place else in the old world. It came from America. And when people began to bring the potato back to the old world, so to speak, they found that it was easy to plant, it was cheap to plant, it was pretty good tasting, and as a matter of fact, if you were really good at it, and Irish mothers and grandmothers became really good at it, that they can make 3 meals, 4 meals a day just using potatoes, different varieties of potatoes. Really, it wasn't unusual for kids to go to school with a couple of baked potatoes in their pocket for their lunch, because if you ate a diet of just potatoes, and occasionally had milk or cheese or something like that, nutritionally, you were fine. You didn't need anything else. So the potato was a big deal. Anyway, my point is that in most of Europe, the potato was part of the dinner table. In Ireland, however, it was like 80% or 90% of the dinner table. It was predominant. Why do I say this? Because in the middle of the 19th century, this potato famine struck Ireland. And the reason that it did is because of disease that probably originated, interestingly enough, in America, came to Ireland. How? Trading ships, right? Came to Ireland and spread all over Europe, but in Ireland it was absolutely, totally devastating. because it killed 90% of the potato crop. And nowhere else in Europe were the people so predominantly dependent upon potatoes as an island. It was the only place. They ate it everywhere. They ate potatoes everywhere. But nowhere was it as dominant in that poor population as an island. So the result was, besides the people dying of typhus, in most of Europe, between 1845 and 1852, it probably killed 1 million Irish. And another 1.5 million Irish emigrated to America. We see a product of the emigration right here, ladies and gentlemen. Colonization by Great Britain created a situation where the Irish were not only poor, but they were desperately poor. By 1847, it destroyed, like I say, 80 to 90% of the crop, widespread homelessness. There were incidences of cannibalism in Ireland. I mean, it was horrible. Typhus, dysentery, cholera flourished in together. In small apartments were even worse. Once the immigrants came to America, and it would duplicate there. What? Really? Okay. Got sick, died on the ships coming over. Typhus, it became known as ship fever because people were dying from typhus just coming as they were emigrating to America. And dysentery rose too. Hospitals in Canada and New York were overcrowded with the Irish sick. Thousands died in a few months. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to pick up talking about World War I and typhus when we come back next time. I don't know. I'm hoping I can finish next week. You got to talk faster. Any questions, comments about any of the stuff we talked about today?
Did the lady Mary is there any proof that she was the one, or is this just fantasy?
It's neither fantasy nor is there proof. It's somewhere in the middle, probably closer to proof. The idea was that, huh?
So they use a woman.
Yeah.
No, but
You're right.
right. But the idea was that she probably was infected.
Yeah.
Was she the only one? That's the only reason why there's no way we can tell for sure.
Okay.
But that's where we get the impression Typhoid Mary. I mean, you've heard that before.
Right.
Any other questions, comments, observations, funny stories, anything?
I was going to ask you,
Yes,
did you enjoy researching this?
I did, and that's a great question. I did. I've in teaching history subjects, I've talked about things like the Black Death and the Columbian Exchange. We talked about that, bringing the diseases and stuff. And so I've talked about diseases before, never as intensely as when preparing for this. So, you know me, I love to learn those kinds of things, and I felt a little maybe like I was out of my element because there was a lot of medical stuff. I mean, there's certain medical things we have to have definitions of what the diseases are and stuff. So I would sometimes ask colleagues or people who were more prone medically about things. But no, the whole process I enjoyed, yes.
I'm glad, because I felt that it was an important subject to talk about based on today's world.
Oh, it was perfect. It was your idea. I gave you credit before. If not, I'll give you credit again. I will. It was your idea. It was your idea to do this particular on epidemics in history.
Well, I'm glad you weren't.
And I think not at all bored. No, I made my friend a little crazy. I made my friend a little crazy over here.
I'm sorry, friend.
It's okay.
You
But
can stick more pins in my doll.
Okay, you got it.
anything else, ladies?
So next
is the
the
last one.
Okay.
Hopefully we'll get to COVID. I don't have a great, I'm not feeling good about getting to COVID by then, but I'm going to try.
Well, I can stay for longer than an hour.
Oh, well, thank you. Maybe,
He probably doesn't wanna speak longer.
no. Maybe we can do that. Maybe go a little bit longer.
Yeah,
Yeah, and finish it.
sure, I'm not gonna be here, so I'm gonna get to COVID.
Any other questions, comments?
Interesting.
Take care, ladies. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.